Have you ever feared that you might not live long enough to protect someone you love? Thomas had asked himself this question countless times. At 68 years old, Thomas found himself the sole guardian of his 10-year-old grandson, Ethan. In the quiet moments of dawn, as he rubbed the ache in his knees and brewed their morning tea, Thomas's mind often wandered to dark, uneasy places. What would happen to Ethan if I weren't here tomorrow? This haunting insecurity loomed over Thomas's heart every day, a shadow cast by both age and love. Ethan was the bright center of Thomas's world. A gentle, curious boy with warm brown eyes and an ever-ready smile, Ethan had come into Thomas's care under difficult circumstances. Ethan's mother, Thomas's daughter-in-law, had passed away when Ethan was just a toddler, taken by a sudden illness. And Ethan's father, Thomas's only son, had drifted away in the aftermath, unable to cope with the loss and responsibilities. In that painful void, Thomas stepped forward. He became more than a grandfather. He became a parent once again in his golden years. He recalled the day he truly took on that role, a day when his grieving son had placed a confused, tearful Ethan into Thomas's arms, unable to cope after the funeral. Ethan had only been 2, whimpering for his mommy, and Thomas had gently rocked the little boy until the sobs subsided. In that moment, Thomas promised himself and Ethan that he would take care of him from then on. It was a promise that had guided Thomas every single day since. Yet in quiet moments, Thomas felt the weight of his years. He worried whether his hands, now spotted and a little unsteady, could still catch Ethan if he stumbled. He worried if his voice, sometimes cracking with age, could still read aloud all the bedtime stories Ethan would want to hear as he grew. He worried if his savings, carefully set aside for retirement, would stretch enough to provide everything a growing boy needed. These were the insecurities that kept Thomas awake at night, the fears every grandfather in his position carries silently, the fear of not being enough. Still, every morning as the sun rose, those worries were dispelled by the sound of Ethan's footsteps padding into the kitchen. "Good morning, Grandpa," Ethan would chirp, wrapping his small arms around Thomas in a hug that made Thomas's heart swell. In those moments, Thomas felt young at heart. The love they shared formed an invisible armor, warding off the lingering anxieties, at least for a while. The days in their little household followed a simple, comforting rhythm. They lived in a modest suburban home on a quiet street, the kind lined with old oak trees and friendly neighbors who waved from their porches. Thomas had lived there for decades. It was the house in which he'd raised his own son, and now it was filled once more with the laughter of a child. In the mornings after breakfast, Thomas would walk Ethan to the school bus stop at the corner. More often than not, Ethan would insist on carrying his own backpack to show Grandpa he was grown up. But Thomas would still sneak in to lighten the load by holding one strap or carrying Ethan's lunchbox. They talked about everything on those short walks, how the seasons were changing, what Ethan dreamed about last night, or what new comic book hero he was fascinated by this week. Ethan peppered his grandfather with questions about the world. "Why do the leaves turn gold, Grandpa?" Or, "Did you have superheroes when you were a kid?" And Thomas answered each one with patience and a twinkle in his eye. Sometimes his answers turned into nostalgic tales of Thomas's own childhood or stories of Ethan's father as a boy, and Ethan would listen with rapt attention, eyes wide with curiosity. Those moments were precious threads weaving their hearts tightly together. Thomas cherished how Ethan's face lit up hearing about how his dad used to catch frogs by the creek in summertime, or the time Grandpa as a young man marched in a civil rights rally. These stories made their family history come alive for Ethan and reaffirmed for Thomas that his life, his memories and experiences still had so much value to impart. Even as he aged, he remained a sturdy bridge to the past for his grandson, and in turn, Ethan was a bridge to the future for Thomas, a future Thomas desperately wanted to see. After the bus pulled away each morning, Thomas would exchange a few friendly words with the other parents at the stop. One young mother once told him brightly, "I hope I have your energy when I'm your age, Mr. Thompson." Thomas chuckled politely, but the comment lingered. "Am I really getting too old for this?" he wondered. The familiar worry tugged at him. Did others think he wasn't up to the task of raising a child in his sunset years? He He pushed that doubt aside as best he could. With the bus out of sight, he would adjust his cap, smile to himself, and make the walk back home. After sending Ethan off to school each day, Thomas returned to an empty house and a quieter routine. He tended a small vegetable garden out back. Ethan's favorite cherry tomatoes grew there, and often spent the midday hours volunteering at the local library or puttering around fixing things at home. Thomas had retired from his job as a postal clerk some years ago, but staying active kept him spry. He knew he had to keep his body strong and mind sharp, as Ethan depended on him. Yet he moved a bit slower than he used to. Sometimes after an afternoon of chores, he'd feel a twinge in his back and worry. How many more years will my body hold up chasing after a young boy? On such days, he'd quietly take an extra pill for blood pressure or rub a bit of liniment on his knees, determined not to let Ethan see any hint of weakness. When the school bus dropped Ethan off in the afternoons, Thomas was always there at the curb, rain or shine, leaning on his wooden cane with a broad grin. Ethan would bound off the bus and straight into his grandfather's arms, bursting with stories about his day, how he aced a spelling test, or the new friend he made in art class, or the funny joke his teacher told. Thomas lived for these stories. They would slowly walk home together, Ethan sometimes skipping ahead, and then circling back as Thomas watched with pride and a touch of breathlessness, trying to keep up. He would tease Ethan, saying, "Slow down, I'm not as quick as I used to be," to which Ethan would laugh and take his grandpa's hand. That small hand in his. Nothing in the world felt more precious or anchoring. Evenings were their sacred time. Thomas would cook dinner, nothing fancy, maybe spaghetti with meatballs or a hearty chicken soup on colder days, and Ethan would help by stirring the pot or setting the table. They'd eat together at the kitchen table, which was scratched with years of use and memories. Sometimes they'd play a simple game like cards after dinner, or work on Ethan's homework together. Math was never Thomas's strong suit, and he joked that Ethan might end up teaching him a thing or two. They'd laugh about how Grandpa always kept a calculator handy just in case. After dishes were done, they often settled in the living room. Ethan loved to sprawl on the rug with his action figures while Thomas sat in his old armchair reading. But more often than not, the reading would give way to storytelling. "Grandpa, can you tell me about the time you and Grandma drove across the country?" Ethan would ask, eyes gleaming with anticipation for a tale he'd perhaps heard twice before, but never tired of. And Thomas would oblige, painting vivid pictures of a bygone era, of him and his late wife, Margaret, young and adventurous, driving their little car through mountain passes and desert sunsets. He spoke of sleeping under the stars and the unexpected kindness of strangers they met, and as he did, he made sure to highlight the lessons learned about bravery, kindness, and hope. Ethan soaked up every word. Margaret had been gone for 5 years now. She had fallen ill shortly after Ethan's mother died, and some said she passed of a broken heart. Thomas missed her every single day. She had adored Ethan from the moment he was born, how she would have cherished watching him grow. In the quiet of some nights, Thomas found himself whispering to her memory, promising to take good care of the boy they both loved. In Ethan's presence, Thomas found solace for that loss. Sometimes he saw glimmers of Margaret in Ethan, an expression, a laugh, or just the way he sat quietly when thinking. It was in those quiet, reflective moments that Thomas's insecurities would surface again. "I'm the only one left for him. I have to stay healthy. I have to be here tomorrow, and the next day, and as many days as it takes to see him safe and grown." The weight of that responsibility was immense, yet he bore it gladly, fueled by love. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves tumbled along the sidewalks and the scent of pumpkin pie wafted from a neighbor's window, Thomas took Ethan to the nearby park. It was a Saturday tradition. They'd feed the ducks at the pond and then play a short game of soccer on the grassy field. Thomas would be the goalie. His knees wouldn't allow much running, and Ethan would try his best to score on him, which usually ended in fits of laughter whether the ball found the makeshift goal or not. That day, after an exuberant kick sent the ball sailing past Thomas's shoulder, Ethan raced after it, cheering his own goal. Thomas clapped proudly, but as he walked over to fetch the ball with Ethan, He noticed the boy breathing hard, hands on his knees. "You okay, sport?" Thomas asked, gently rubbing Ethan's back. Ethan nodded, but his face was pale. "Just a little dizzy," he admitted softly. Thomas guided him to sit on a bench under an oak tree. He fetched their water bottle, encouraging Ethan to drink. However, over the next couple of weeks, Thomas noticed other small signs that something might be amiss. Ethan seemed more tired than usual. He was a little slower getting out of bed in the mornings, his usual boundless energy dampened by complaints of being so sleepy. A few times he mentioned headaches. One evening, Thomas found Ethan curled up on the couch instead of playing, his math homework untouched on the coffee table. "My head hurts, Grandpa," Ethan said quietly. Thomas felt his forehead. No fever, but the boy's skin felt clammy. Possibly the flu, Thomas thought. He let Ethan rest and made sure he drank water and went to bed early. But the nagging worry in Thomas's mind only grew. The next morning, Thomas decided it was best to keep Ethan home from school and take him to the doctor. In the doctor's brightly lit office, with cartoon animal posters on the walls, Thomas sat anxiously while Dr. Miller examined Ethan. After a series of questions and a physical exam, Dr. Miller frowned slightly at the pallor of Ethan's skin and the dark circles under his eyes. "He has been unusually tired, and he mentioned headaches," Thomas explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yesterday he got dizzy just playing in the park. I thought it might be a virus going around, but..." Dr. Miller nodded thoughtfully and suggested some blood tests for Ethan, just to rule out a few things. Thomas felt a lump in his throat as they walked down the hall to the lab. Rule out what? He wondered, heart thudding. He kept these fears from Ethan, of course, cracking a joke about the lollipop he'd earned for being brave during the blood draw. Ethan managed a grin. They returned home afterward, and Thomas made Ethan his favorite peanut butter and banana sandwich, trying to act as if everything was normal. But his hands trembled a little as he sliced the bread, and his mind was far from calm. He'd been through enough in life to know that when a doctor looks concerned, you can't help but fear the worst. A day later, Dr. Miller called, asking them to come in for a follow-up. The tone of the call told Thomas this wasn't just a simple result. That evening, as Thomas prepared a simple dinner, he caught himself staring out the kitchen window, the spatula motionless in his hand as the soup simmered. His gut churned with dread. He didn't dare voice his deepest worry, not even in an empty room. The fear that something could be seriously wrong with Ethan. The mere thought of his grandson facing any grave illness was enough to make Thomas' knees threaten to buckle. "I have to be strong for him," he reminded himself, straightening up and breathing deeply. At the clinic the next morning, they were led not to the usual cheerful exam room, but to Dr. Miller's private office. Thomas's heart pounded. Ethan sat close to his grandfather, sensing something different too, his small hand finding Thomas's and squeezing it. Thomas squeezed back reassuringly, even as his own palms grew damp. Dr. Miller took a seat across from them, his eyes kind but serious behind his glasses. He took a moment, as if carefully choosing words that wouldn't to frighten a child or break a grandfather, as heart all at once. "The blood tests show some irregularities, Thomas," he began gently. "Ethan's white blood cell counts are very high, and there are other markers. We need to do more tests, but it could be something called leukemia." The word hung in the air like a dark cloud. Leukemia. Thomas's breath caught in his chest. He felt Ethan's hand tense in his. That's cancer, isn't it?" Thomas managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Miller nodded solemnly. "It is a type of blood cancer, yes. But before we jump to conclusions, I want to refer you to a specialist, a pediatric oncologist at the city hospital, to confirm the diagnosis and discuss treatment, if needed." He looked at Ethan with a gentle smile. "We've caught these signs early, and if it is leukemia, there have been many advances in treatment. Many children do very well, Ethan." Ethan looked up at his grandfather, confusion and fear swimming in his young eyes. He was old enough to understand that cancer was a scary word. Thomas fought to keep his composure, swallowing the lump in his throat that felt as large as a fist. He reached over and stroked Ethan's hair. "We're just going to see another doctor who knows all about this, okay? They'll tell us exactly what's going on," he said, trying to sound soothing and confident, though his insides were quivering. Dr. Miller arranged an appointment for them at the city hospital for the very next day. Everything seemed to move in a blur. One moment, Thomas was thinking Ethan might have a simple flu, and now they were talking about oncologists and hospital visits. As they left the clinic, Thomas realized his hand was shaking when he tried to sign some forms. Ethan noticed and wrapped his arms around his grandfather's waist. "It's okay, Grandpa," he said softly, as if their roles had reversed and he was the one comforting Thomas. "We'll be okay, right?" Thomas knelt down, ignoring the creak in his knees, and hugged Ethan tightly. He felt the boy's heartbeat against his own chest. "Of course we will," Thomas whispered, praying his words could somehow shape reality. "We're together, and we're going to get through whatever comes. I promise." As they walked out into the bright autumn sun, Thomas held Ethan's hand firmly. Inside, he felt a swirl of emotions, terror at the thought of his beloved grandson being seriously ill, determination to do everything in his power to protect him, and a gnawing fear. Am I strong enough for this? For a man of his age, caring for a sick child would be an enormous challenge, physically, emotionally, financially. Thomas was painfully aware of his own limitations, but one look at Ethan's trusting face steeled his resolve. No matter what it took, he would not let his grandson down. That night, neither of them slept much. Thomas let Ethan camp out in his bed with him, a rarity that made the boy feel a little better as darkness fell. Ethan curled against his grandfather, and Thomas told soothing stories, half-remembered fairy tales and adventures, until Ethan's eyes finally closed. But even as the child slept, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his hand gently on Ethan, eyes back, as if to reassure both of them that he was still there. The question that started their story echoed now louder than ever in Thomas' mind. What if I am not able to save him? In the stillness of that midnight, Thomas silently prayed to any power listening to give him the strength and time needed to see Ethan through this trial. The cool moonlight fell across the bedroom floor as Thomas resolved that, come morning, they would face whatever awaited at the hospital together, bound by a love that had already carried them through so much. The following morning, Thomas, 68-year-old man, and Ethan, 10-year-old white boy, made the trip to the city hospital to meet the specialist. The pediatric oncologist confirmed their fears the diagnosis was acute lymphoblastic leukemia. They were admitted that very day to start the first round of chemotherapy. Everything happened so fast. One moment, Ethan was nervously sipping apple juice in the playroom, and the next he was being settled into a hospital bed, with nurses inserting an IV line into his arm. The boy looked small and frightened as a nurse hung a bag of medicine on the IV pole. Thomas sat by his side, holding Ethan's hand through every moment, murmuring encouragement. "This medicine is going to help make you better, sweetheart," he said softly, brushing Ethan's hair back from his forehead. Ethan nodded bravely, though his eyes brimmed with tears of uncertainty. That night, after one particularly exhausting day, Thomas returned to Ethan's bedside and found the boy awake, eyes glistening in the low light. "Grandpa, were you crying?" Ethan asked softly. Thomas quickly wiped his face and mustered a smile as he sat down. "I'm okay, kiddo," he whispered, taking Ethan's small hand in his. "I was just thinking about how brave you are." Ethan scooted over a bit, his voice trembling. "I'm scared. Will I be okay?" Thomas felt a pang in his heart. He gently smoothed Ethan's blanket and replied quietly, "The doctors are doing everything to make you better, and I'm right here with you. I'm not going anywhere." Ethan looked up, eyes wide and searching. "Promise?" he peeped. Thomas leaned over to kiss his forehead. "I promise, my boy. Now try to get some sleep." Ethan nodded and finally closed his eyes, his grip on Thomas's hand slowly loosening as he drifted off. Thomas stayed by his side long after, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest and vowing to himself that he would keep that promise. A couple of weeks into treatment, Ethan faced another difficult change. His hair began to fall out. One morning he ran a hand through his once thick brown locks, only to pull away a fistful of loose strands. Startled, Ethan's eyes welled with tears. "Grandpa, my hair," he choked out, holding the strands between trembling fingers. Thomas's heart twisted at the sight. He gently took the hair from Ethan's hand and fetched a soft knitted cap from a care package a neighbor had left. With tender care, he fitted it over Ethan's head. "It's okay, sweetheart," Thomas said soothingly. "Your hair will grow back." In the early days of treatment, neighbors and classmates showered Ethan, 10-year-old white boy, with support, get-well cards, casseroles, and offers to help. But as the weeks turned into months, financial worries mounted as co-pays and other expenses piled up. Late one night, Thomas, 68 years old, found himself poring over a stack of hospital bills by the dim light of a bedside lamp. His modest savings would only stretch so far. If it gives Ethan a chance, nothing is off limits, he resolved, even if it meant dipping into his retirement fund. He even reached out to his old friend Robert for help, but although Robert sympathized, in the end, no help came. It was another quiet hurt for Thomas, but he carried on. Meanwhile, the physical toll on Thomas was becoming evident. He stayed at the hospital most nights, sleeping upright in a chair next to Ethan's bed. His back ached constantly, and his legs felt stiff. One afternoon, as he stood up too fast after refilling Ethan's water cup, a wave of dizziness washed over him, and he had to grip the bed rail to steady himself. Ethan noticed. "Grandpa, are you okay?" he asked, voice weak but concerned. Thomas mustered a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, my boy. Just stood up too quickly, that's all." He forced himself to eat and rest in small snatches, determined not to let his own health falter. The last thing he wanted was for Ethan to worry about him on top of everything else. Chemotherapy progressed, and after about a month, the doctors had hopeful news. Ethan's cancer was responding to treatment. His white blood cell counts were coming down, and there were signs the leukemia was retreating. Thomas wept tears of relief when he heard the word remission cautiously used by Dr. Patel. He shared a gentle, tearful hug with Ethan upon hearing the news, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "See? I told you these medicines would work," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion as he stroked Ethan's pale cheek. Ethan managed a smile, a real one that reached his eyes, for the first time in weeks. For a short while, it seemed the worst was behind them. The doctors even allowed Ethan to go home for a couple of weeks to regain strength between treatments. They shared a quiet Thanksgiving dinner, just the two of them at their own kitchen table, grateful beyond words to be together at home. In the comfort of familiar surroundings, Ethan grew a bit stronger each day, and Thomas dared to believe that the illness was finally gone for good. But their relief was short-lived. In mid-December, during a routine follow-up just before the next phase of treatment, the doctors delivered an unexpected blow. Ethan's test results showed abnormal cells again. The leukemia was back. Thomas felt as if the ground had crumbled beneath his feet when Dr. Patel explained the relapse. "This can happen," she said gently. "It means we need to try a more aggressive approach now. A bone marrow transplant is our best option to give Ethan a cure."
That discussion forced Thomas to confront a painful reality. He could not fight this battle alone. The only family member who might save was his estranged father, David.
That night, heart in throat, Thomas picked up the phone and called his son for the first time in nearly a year. He told David about Ethan's relapse and the urgent need for a donor. David was shocked into sober attention by the news. With a shaky voice, he promised he would come to the hospital and do whatever he could to help his boy. True to his word, David showed up a few days later at the hospital. Thomas watched with a mix of relief and apprehension as his son, looking worn and nervous, stepped into the room. Tears sprang to David's eyes at the sight of Ethan's frail form, and he awkwardly gathered the boy in a gentle hug for the first time in years. Ethan clung to his father, overjoyed and hungry for his affection. But the hope David brought was soon dashed. Tests revealed that David was not a compatible match for the transplant. The news devastated him. Overwhelmed by guilt and unable to handle seeing his son so ill, David disappeared from the hospital that very night without a proper goodbye. The next morning, Thomas found only a crumpled note on the chair where his son had slept. I'm sorry, I can't. It was a crushing betrayal of their fragile hope, leaving Thomas to somehow explain to Ethan that his father was gone again. When Thomas gently told Ethan that David had left, the boy turned his face to the wall, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. Thomas could only rub his back and murmur comforts, heartbroken to witness yet another wound on his grandson's innocent heart. Fortunately, within days, the doctors located an unrelated donor match from the registry, a stranger whose selfless act gave Ethan a chance. The bone marrow transplant was performed as soon as possible, and then came an agonizing period of waiting as Ethan lay in isolation, his body struggling to accept the new marrow. That evening, Ethan had spiked a dangerous fever from an infection, sending doctors and nurses rushing to stabilize him. Thomas hovered at his bedside, sick with worry, until the fever finally broke just past midnight. Even then, Ethan remained so fragile and pale that Thomas's nerves were left frayed. With his heart heavy and adrenaline spent, Thomas sought refuge in the small hospital chapel down the hall. Thomas sank into a pew, exhaustion and despair catching up to him. He bowed his head and in a trembling whisper poured out a prayer. "Please let him live," he pleaded, tears rolling down his cheeks. "Let me take on his pain, but don't take him away. He's all I have, and I'm all he has." In the silence, Thomas also confessed his deepest fear. "I don't know if I am strong enough for this. Please give me strength to see him through." His words echoed in the stillness. After a long while, Thomas wiped his eyes and returned to Ethan's bedside, heart heavy but resolved to stay strong a little longer. Slowly, day by day, 10 years old, Ethan began to recover. The donor's marrow grafted successfully. His lab tests gradually showed healthy new blood cells taking hold. When the doctors confirmed the transplant was working, his grandfather, 68 years old Thomas, wept tears of joy and gratitude. There were still hurdles ahead, weeks of careful monitoring and hopes that no complications would arise, but the worst had passed. After a tense period of waiting, the doctors finally declared the leukemia in remission once more. At last came the day Ethan was well enough to go home. Back home, life slowly found a new normal. Thomas fussed over Ethan's diet and medications, and Ethan, happy to be in his own bed, gradually regained his strength among familiar comforts. People's true colors had shown during their long ordeal. One warm evening months later, they visited the park where Ethan had first felt sick. Sitting on their familiar bench under the old oak tree, Ethan rested his head against his grandfather's shoulder as dusk fell. "Grandpa," he asked softly, "do you still worry about not being around for me?" Thomas paused, gazing at the fireflies blinking in the gathering dark. "I used to worry all the time," he admitted quietly. "I was so afraid I wouldn't be there when you needed me. But after everything we've been through, I've learned how strong love can make us. Even when I felt I had nothing left, my love for you kept me going. And your love gave me strength too." Ethan looked up at him, eyes warm. "I tried to be brave because I didn't want you to worry," he said. Thomas smiled and hugged him closer. "My boy, you never have to hide when you're scared or sad. We got through the worst because we were there for each other. That's what love does. It keeps us going." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "I'm really glad you're here, Grandpa." Thomas felt emotion swell in his chest. "Me too, Ethan," he replied, his voice thick. "I'm not so afraid anymore. Every day I get to spend with you is a gift, and I'm grateful for it." Ethan hesitated, then added in a small voice, "I'm sorry Dad left again." Thomas sighed and squeezed his hand. "It hurt that he left, yes, but that's on him, not on us. Maybe someday he'll find his way. But no matter what happens, we have each other. And that's more than enough for me." Ethan nodded and managed a tiny smile. The pain of his father's absence was there, but together they could bear it. After a while, Thomas cleared his throat and said, "How about we get some ice cream on the way home?" Ethan's face lit up. "Even though it's almost bedtime?" he asked, a spark of the playful boy returning. Thomas chuckled softly. "We've earned a celebration, don't you think?" Hand in hand, they rose from the bench and began making their way out of the park. Ethan, looking up at the night sky, began to chatter about all the things he wanted to do now that he was feeling better. See his friends at school again, play soccer next season, maybe go to the beach with Grandpa when summer came. Thomas listened with a heart full of gratitude, each simple plan for the future feeling like a precious gift. They walked home under the first stars and gentle streetlights, fireflies dancing around their feet. Thomas moved a bit slower these days, and Ethan matched his pace without a word. With each step, Thomas felt a deep peace settle within him. The future was still uncertain, but he was no longer paralyzed by fear of it. They had weathered the worst storm together. Whatever tomorrow might bring, he knew their bond would carry them through, one step at a time, together. Thomas thought back to the question that had once kept him up at night, whether he'd be around long enough to protect his grandson. As he listened to Ethan's sweet laughter echo down the quiet street, that old fear finally fell away. However many years remained, Thomas knew he would spend them devoted to his grandson, cherishing each day. Their love had carried them through the darkest of times, and that love would light every tomorrow that they were blessed to share.